morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to this lecture in Christian theology where we're going to be exploring the Lord's Prayer, the pronoun our, and think about our in regards to me or to us. The Theological Anthropology. How do we think about what it means to be human, to be a person? Now, one way to start out is to look in the mirror. As some have said that a mirror is the best virtual reality kind of system or technology that we have. But what happens when you look in the mirror? Is that one way to kind of understand who you are? Right? Who are you when you look into a mirror? Can you perceive accurately what it is you're seeing? Now, mirrors actually are quite deceptive. And scientists have shown that people don't realize actually that what they see on the mirror has to kind of go through this process of translation, because the size of the image that you see on the mirror, on the surface of the mirror, is actually half the size that you perceive it to be. And so what you are actually doing is you are seeing through the mirror, right? And so here in this news article around kind of mirror images, it says that people typically look through a mirror at the reflection, not at a mirror. And I think that's really interesting, right? Stepping away from the mirror does not change the size of the image because the mirror is always halfway between the observer and the virtual reflection. And so there's something fascinating. I find it fascinating. And this is why magicians always are using mirrors, right? Smoke and mirrors. So mirrors might not be a best tool to kind of understand who you are as a person. In fact, there were studies given to highly intelligent primates and other animals, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas, and I think it was also in regards to elephants and dolphins. And what they did is they provided a mirror for these animals. First to a group that were raised in social conditions with others of their species. They provided a mirror. And then to those in those species who had been raised in isolation, not within social groups of the same kind. And they provided them a mirror. When they provided a mirror to those who were raised in isolation, what they found is when a mirror was presented to them, what they saw in the image was some other animal. Right? It wasn't in any way tied to them. Almost kind of, they thought that what they were seeing was another kind of primate, another dolphin, elephant, etc., etc. But when the mirror was given to those who were raised in social groups, right, together, instantly they started grooming and realizing that who they saw in the mirror was themselves. So that what they saw was that self-reflection, being able to kind of understand who one is, only comes or is very much enforced by community. That I know who I am because of you. All right? Because I'm in relationship with you. So that I know who I am in relationship. Apart from that relationship, it's really difficult to have self-reflection. And this is one of those things that Strawn and Warren in your book, The Physical Nature of the Christian Life, they pick up on this, right? So when you think about yourself, your individual as a person, it's really difficult to even be able to kind of think of oneself individually apart from the relationships that we have. The we, the plural, is in part most important for kind of understanding what it means to be a person. It's we are, not I am. Okay? Now, when it comes to kind of what distinguishes theological anthropology as a kind of, or the history of theological anthropology, has been trying to kind of distinguish what makes humans different from other creatures. And so what I'm going to show you here is that for many centuries, decades, for a long time, people used to think that morality, that the humans were moral creatures and animals just operated out of instinct. But new scientific studies have shown that that is not the case. Let me show you a clip from this video.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So what you see in that video is that there's this sense of fairness, right? There's a fairness. It's like, they're getting the grapes, and I'm getting this cucumber. That's not fair. That provides a sense of kind of morality, right? You kind of injustice. And so that's not necessarily what might distinguish us from other creatures. Many of you may have seen this scene. This is kind of was famous. I think it took place 2 years ago. A monkey had fallen and then looked like it was drowning, but this other monkey comes and rescues it and it basically does kind of CPR on the monkey to bring it back to life. And you can find it at this link. So kind of care or love for others in a group is also demonstrated within kind of fellow creatures. Now, some have talked about also kind of crying, that crying might be something that distinguishes humans from other animals. Now, pet owners might say, well, my dog whimpers or things, but the actual kind of the empathic crying is what one Dutch scientist, Vingerhost, Dr. Vingerhost, said, wrote this in his book, Why Only Humans Weep, Unraveling the Mystery of Tears. And so that's been a kind of a candidate, but I'm sure the other scientists will find other animals that find humans crying. Laughter is also one of these areas that some scientists have said distinguishes humans from other animals. Now, again, people might say, well, I've seen birds laugh or this and these scientists would say, no, that's not true laughter, because laughter is something highly also relational. This is what Robert Province, in his book Laughter, A Scientific Investigation, looks at, that there's a kind of a relationality. That's why when you watch Stand Up By Yourself, it's harder to laugh at something than when you're in the auditorium with others, then you're experiencing laughter. Some of you might be familiar with kind of laughter yoga. It's popular in some Asian countries, but also kind of now across the world, where you just laugh, and you laugh together over nothing, but it's contagious, but also seen as very healthy for you. Some other scientists have said that what distinguishes humans from animals is the grandmother hypothesis. For other mammals and other creatures, there isn't kind of a menopause, right? And so other female creatures can reproduce offspring until they die, where that's not predominantly the case for humans, right? And part of the argument, this is from the research of Kristen Hawkes, part of the argument is that humans understand the need for help in raising children, which is why women lose kind of fertility in menopause. But her argument is that this is something extremely unique. Menopause is something unique to humans, though some are starting to see parallels with, I think, orca whales as well. So, Ahit Varki and Danny Brower talk about the concept of the denial of mortality is an extremely human trait. Only humans deny their own mortality, and it allows them for greater risk taking and in many ways thriving in society. This is their argument. Whereas animals and other creatures are always aware of their mortality, and therefore kind of the kind of fight or flight instinct is much stronger in them. So there's lots of candidates for what distinguishes persons or humans from animals, but almost inevitably, those have been kind of challenged with further science. Now, in the early church and for most of history, that was rationality. What distinguishes human beings from all other creatures are kind of rational beings, and this is something that Thomas Aquinas takes up. But those aren't that kind of way of thinking about what it means to be a human person, in distinction from creatures, is problematic. It's a theology that starts from a negative standpoint, right? It's saying we are not X or we are not Y. We're distinguishing them. What we really need to do is say, okay, what might be a positive theological anthropology? How do we understand ideas like imago Dei, the image of God? So here are some contenders. Co-humanity, right? For Karl Barth, male and female was important. And so it's this kind of relational concept that's important. However, there are male and female cohorts of other animals. So it's not necessarily the strongest contender. But when in Genesis God says, "Let us make humanity or in our image, male and female," that might be a contender. Another one is that the image of God in that first narrative is tied into a creator God, the kind of the describing and work of a creator God, so that maybe what it means to be an image bearer is to be creative, somebody who can make tools and create things and build things. But we also see that in creation. We see monkeys creating tools and building structures and things like that. We see that also with birds. One of the strongest candidates is kind of this artisan, ruler, priest, a vocational understanding of the image of God, rather than kind of an ontological one. And what by vocation, I say that there is a task. There is something that we are called to participate in that is human, that is image bearing. And this is tied to kind of an argument made by Richard Middleton in his book, The Liberating Image, which is probably the best book on the image of God from a biblical standpoint that exists. And so I highly recommend it. And what I want to focus in on now is this kind of priestly vocation. Images of deities, images of priests were often placed in temples. And there's a temple analogy that's being played with in the Genesis 1 and 2 accounts. And what does a priest do? It mediates praise. So in many ways, what God is creating in creating heaven and earth is creating a home, a temple for God's self that God will rest in once it's built. And what is necessary are priests, image bearers, those that can help facilitate and steward creation's praise of their Creator. And so prayer is a key component of that. Now, Jesus Christ is the best place to start with understanding what it means to be an image bearer, because we are told in 2 Corinthians and Colossians and Hebrews and in John something about the nature of Jesus as the image of God. And what we see in other places is that Christ as the salvific renewal of the image is in the church. And you see these other scriptural references. And who is Jesus? According to the book of Hebrews, he is our high priest who intercedes on our behalf, our sacrifice, the first fruits of new creation, our Savior. And so to be in the image is to be like Christ, a prayer, a worshiper. That's one argument I'd like you to think about, is that when we are living and growing as image bearers, we are growing into people of worship and praise, people who help facilitate creation's praise, who enter into Jesus's praise of the Father. And all of this takes place Trinitarianly, right? We pray to the Father with the Son, empowered by the Holy Spirit. So this is one way of thinking about the image of God. It's predominant in Orthodox Christianity, and people like John Zizelus, Alexander Schmemann, and others would be good sources for exploring this connection. What does it mean to be in the image of God? It's not all these other things that I mentioned: rationality, crying, praying, crying, or laughing. Those are interesting. They might be kind of brought into a broader discussion, but a good starting point is Jesus Christ, and Jesus as our high priest, someone who serves God's people for the benefit of the Father, for the ministry of the Father, is really important and is tied, I would argue, to prayer, a priestly vocation. Now, what I want to kind of talk about is that the arguments or the thinking around humans being bipart or tripartite creatures. And this is tied to soul. What does it mean to have a soul or be a soul? And part of this is tied to conversations with scientific innovations about what does it mean to be a person, particularly neuroscience. Now, the most comprehensive view of the soul was outlined by Thomas Aquinas, using the work De Anima, on the soul, by Aristotle. And so Thomas talked about kind of vegetative soul, animal soul, and rational soul. And so only the human being had all the aspects of the vegetative, animal, and rational. Okay? But what kind of the things that we've talked about in regards to kind of monkeys, rationality, morality, this kind of sense of fairness, that was reduced or seen as only solely something that was part of a rational soul for Aquinas. And so we see that this kind of rational view is problematic. But what this did was start to kind of create this dualism, right? That really gets caught up in René Descartes, who, walking through the streets of Paris, saw these hydraulic automaton fountains, right? And said, there's something energizing this, and this kind of this water mechanism that's energizing these kind of almost kind of like if you've been to Disneyland and on those rides, and you have these animatronic, however you say that, characters. But in France, it was water. And so he started talking about kind of like there's the body, the physical kind of fountain, and then there's the water that makes the fountain work. And the water was tied to the soul, and the fountain was tied to the body. Now, that kind of dualism is really strong and becomes more influential in modern times. But with the rise of neuroscience, we started seeing that kind of the things that we assigned towards the soul, like functions of the soul, like rationality or morality, through fMRI studies and functional brain studies, we saw that those actually were functions of the brain in certain regions of it. And that started making us think, well, if it was the soul part, the kind of rational soul part that helped us kind of think about morality and decision making and rationality, but then now we see that actually they're also closely tied to a part of the brain with modern neuroscience, that raised new questions and new biblical interpretive strategies. One thing that we see, and we knew for quite a long time, is that the Old Testament has a monistic view of the person. Nephesh doesn't translate as soul as some other aspect. It's the life. It's this breath, right? That it's part of a holistic understanding of what it means to be alive and a human being. It's not some kind of added additional component to a body. Rather, it is completely integral to life. And so nephesh is not translated into soul in our modern conceptions of an additional thing, right? A body and soul that kind of come together. That's a problematic view. The Old Testament, leading scholars, even those who want to kind of talk about a dualistic anthropology, talk about the monistic aspect of the Old Testament. There is no kind of death and then a rising of a soul or a soul escaping the body. Death is ultimate, and Sheol is part of that. When it comes to the New Testament, the Greek language of psuche, right, and soma and other terms were more used in Greek philosophy, like Aristotle. And so there's a sense that people think that, well, this was more in line with Aristotelian kind of Greek thought. But what we find in Paul and others is that there also is a strong holism or monism of theological anthropology. So that it's not that you're kind of body, soul, and spirit, but those are kind of, that's just a way of kind of emphasizing. It's kind of a rhetorical trope of emphasis, the whole of you, right? Not the parts of you put together, but the whole of you. You are a soul. And I will put up a document in your course that goes through some of the passages, right, that often come up and say, well, if that's the case, how do we look at this passage, or how do we look at this other passage that seems to think that they're kind of body and souls, two different things? That's problematic, and I want to help you kind of read those passages differently. Now, the strongest defense for a soul is tied to an argument for continuity in the afterlife. That is to kind of want to say that when you die, your soul survives. Okay? Well, first of all, that's completely unbiblical. There's nowhere in Scripture that talks to the immortality of the soul. We are mortal creatures with all of creation. Our immortality is completely dependent upon God, God's grace and the resurrection, the promise of the resurrection. But there's nothing of us that's immortal. The problem of continuity is based on a fear that what will be raised is actually me. And therefore, for that to be the case, something of me must still be around, and hence the soul. But that is not a strong biblical argument. It's a good philosophical argument, but not a strong biblical, and I would argue not a good theological argument. Because in trying to kind of talk about continuity of something immortal like a soul, what one is afraid of is that God will raise someone else, and therefore it might be a lack of trust in God's memory, ability to resurrect you or me. And that's not faith. That's trying to kind of have some kind of security system. Now, the way in which a body-soul dichotomy or dualism has been used in recent church history has also shown a lot of harm. So, for instance, at the beginning of the colonial movement, when missionaries would see Africans being beaten and sold into slavery, what they started articulating was, within a paradigm of body-soul, is that what can be done to the body is acceptable because the soul will be saved. And so though they would see Africans on the slave block being torn from one another family, and this is actually well documented in many places, there are commentators saying, but this is for the benefit of their salvation, the salvation of their soul. And so this duality, this ability to see somebody as body and soul and only give preference to the soul, allows for the abuse of the body. Not always, but in some cases. Another way that it's been used for centuries is in kind of sexism. So men were seen as more rational, more soulish, kind of reserved, calm, and good thinkers, and women were seen as more bodyish, sensual, unable to kind of cope with their emotions. And so sexism kind of used, and this is in Aristotle. So thousands of years of this use of body-soul use is kind of, again, elevating men as kind of more soulish, more rational, and women as more bodily. And that's another way that has been used. It's also been used in kind of modern spiritual, kind of Gnostic views, that what's true is what is within. And so there's this sense of kind of only what's within matters. And then it's highly individualistic because there is no corporate soul. All right, unless you have, there are ideas of that in Platonic philosophy. But for Christians, there's not a sense of a corporate soul, only individual souls. And so when you talk about theological anthropology and use this kind of idea of a soul, you're right away talking about an individual. Also, on missionary boards, there's debates about how money should be spent. Should it be spent towards the soul and buy Bibles, kind of salvation type of programs? Or should we look at food and other resources? And that has created, and still to this day, creates debates on mission boards about what it means to be a person, because there's kind of this dividing body and soul. And also, I've had conversations with friends who have siblings and relatives with various forms of disability. And for some of them, tragically, there's this sense of body-soul that the soul is intact, but unable to communicate because of this certain disability. And again, here you have this what I call ministerial harm of the modern soul. I want you to think about that. The way in which you view a person shapes the way in which you minister to them. So if you see someone as a body and soul, it is almost impossible for you to not elevate the soul side. And therefore, when it comes to depression, other issues, one can kind of say, well, you might be able to do some soul work and get yourself out of this. And diminishing the kind of physiological, neurological, and other factors that are at play, even the relational factor. So when you minister to bodies and have a dualistic view, you tend to kind of see people as primarily souls with a body. That is unbiblical, and I would argue harmful. We need a more holistic conception, maybe even a monistic view of what it means to be a human person. And so that in their relationships, in their bodies, and in their environments, we need to kind of be ministering to them in those spaces without thinking that there's kind of something more important within them or behind them. Now, that is part of the reasons, besides the kind of biblical and the harmful aspects of a dualism, why I hold on to kind of a more monistic view. And I want you to kind of, with your reading of the kind of physical nature of the Christian life, with kind of understanding the doctrine of the resurrection. It's a resurrection of a body, not a resurrection of the soul. I want you to be challenged and to think about how it is you think about what it means to be human. What does the image of God mean? Is it this vocation of working together to foster creation's praise, to facilitate it, to kind of steward it? Is that part of it? And how might that change our relationships with one another in our common world? There's lots to think about. There's lots of things that you've been thinking about in your reading. But I encourage you to kind of lean into these conversations. And I hope they challenge your conceptions and that they do some good work there. So think about that, and we'll have more conversations in class. For now, blessings and peace.